It is a pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce the speaker today. I've lived in Palo Alto or this area for 25 years, which amazes me. I've heard of CARA for a long time. It's just been part of the environment. But honestly, I didn't know anything about it, it turns out. And so when Sandy Smith, who arranged for this program today, asked me to make the introduction, I went to Google, of course, and I went to the notes that she had left and to the CARA's website. It's an awesome organization, it turns out, and I am really honored and privileged to introduce Jim Mulvaney, who is the Director of Training and Education, to make a presentation to us this morning. So, Jim Mulvaney.
Thank you, Paul. Testing, 1, 2. Thanks, Paul. Well, what you described as you're hearing about CARA but not really knowing much about it is fairly typical, isn't it? Because we typically do not move towards death and loss and dying and grieving without being more or less compelled to, which means something happens in our lives that brings it up. So today I hope to share with you a little bit about my own experience as well as what CARA does, and also to describe to you the grief process itself, because there are lots of different understandings out there about what grief is and what's reasonable and what isn't reasonable and how much time. All of these questions, a lot of different opinions. And I'll also talk about how you can be helpful to someone who is going through grief. And then we'll wrap up with an overview of CARA's services. Now, for those of you who haven't seen the handout yet, there are handouts on the chairs up here, and there should be enough if you come up and grab one for everyone. So first, a little bit about the basic nature of grief. First of all, it's a natural process of resolving loss and change. At CARA, we do not hold grief as being a condition that needs to be fixed or cured. This is a natural process that all human beings go through. We treat it as a natural process. It's not therapy. What CARA offers is a companioning for the bereaved, and the companions are volunteers that have themselves typically had some personal experience of grief and loss. Well, grief affects us not just in one way, but it affects us socially, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And I'll talk a little bit more about those dimensions. Grief knows no time. There's a typical expectation that if you are in a workplace, you'd be lucky to have 1 to 3 days of bereavement. And then when you come back, you're typically expected to be right up to your standard operating speed. It just doesn't happen that way. It's unpredictable. Grief is not a continuous improvement or a continuous healing. Grief is like this. You know, it goes up and down. Over the long term, there is certainly healing and moving on, but you can be blindsided at any moment by a wave of grief. Often we're asked, well, how long should it be since a death for someone to receive grief support? Or how long should I be grieving over something like this? Well, first of all, it's never too late to address grief. We have had some clients that, because of a more recent loss, they find that grief for a previous loss that might have been 10 years or 20 years ago, 30 years ago, comes up with that. Because the feelings of grief can't really distinguish between one loss or another. It's more like a pool of grief. Finally, each individual grieves in their own way. So for a society which is very much in love of standardization and one size fits all, this is not necessarily good news, because we'd like to know what to expect each time we come across it. Each time it's different. Now, before I go on, I want to invite you to either ask a question or make a comment. And to do that, raise your hand, and I understand there will be a mic runner who will come and give you a mic. So let's start with you. Yes. Where's the mic?
I didn't expect you to ask questions.
As you may know, we are a group of atheists. Our solace and comfort are offered in stories and ways which are not religious. Do you have much call for people who are looking for that kind of a companion?
Well, yes, because our clients that come to CAR are from all different backgrounds. Religious, not religious, and so forth. We like to match our clients with the volunteers who are a best match. So one of the questions we ask is about religious background, and given the response to that, we will try to match a client with a counselor that has some similar background or orientation.
Okay, I'm Andrea Dory, and I'd like to make a comment, but first I want to correct the statement. We're not all atheists. Some of us are agnostics, and some of us are, I guess, secular humanists and religious humanists, so you can sort that out. But anyway, I happen to be an atheist. I've been an atheist for a long time, but I'm an agnostic atheist. Don't ask. The comment I had is that I lost my mother some time back, and we had an unresolved issue that I didn't deal with, and what surprised me was the blindsiding that happened. I could be in a store and somebody from the back looked like my mother. I swore it was my mother, and and this is maybe weeks afterwards. But that didn't stop, because there were anniversaries that happened, and I realized this is her birthday. Oh my God, pardon the use of the name. But it was really surprising, the things that knocked me off, and I was in trouble for a number of days. And I think it had to do with the unresolved issues.
Thank you. I'll be going into a number of other aspects of grief in just a moment, so if you could just hold comments until a couple more minutes. So I want to talk a little bit more about what makes grief so different from one person to another, from one loss to another. There are several major factors that will impact that grief experience. The age of the survivor. When I lost my parents in their old age, that was one kind of grief. One of the things I noticed about that is I didn't suffer over any sense of this shouldn't have happened, no sense of injustice. I knew that this was the way of life and death, and that was not a factor in losing my parents in their old age. However, when my wife died suddenly in 2000, without any expectation, without any diagnosis of anything being wrong, that was an entirely different experience. There was the shock of a sudden loss, and that's another factor that will affect the grief experience, whether it's sudden or whether it's expected. And then there was the sense of, she was 55. This shouldn't have happened at 55. I was just not prepared for that. And then another thing was I had always assumed that I would go first. So I had given enough thought to that to make sure that my wife and family would be taken care of in my absence, but I never really went into the scenario of my wife predeceasing me. So there were all kinds of things about that loss that made that unique. Now, some other things that can affect that is the cause of death. Was this an illness? Was it an accident? Was it murder? Was it a suicide? These different kinds of losses will create an entirely unique experience of grief. The nature of the relationship between the survivor and the one who died. We tend to assume that this was a loved one, that there was a positive, loving relationship here. That isn't always the case. Sometimes there can be very negative factors in the relationship, and a person who is in that kind of bereavement experience may experience a whole mix of emotions, ones that may be positive and loving and missing, but also ones that can be relief. Thank God I don't have to put up with that situation anymore. And it's very difficult in that situation to talk or share this kind of experience with anyone because of the judgment that we fear we will get back. Because someone who's died, we tend to hold up on a pedestal. Okay? So someone who is bereaving and feeling these different kinds of emotions around the loss may not feel that these can be shared. And that's part of why CARA is here. Because CARA counselors will sit with whatever it is that you have to share without judgment and without agenda, and no need to fix it, just to be with you. Another thing affecting the grief process is whether you have support or not. When I was growing up as a child, and I'm sure most of you, we weren't even conscious of grief process. It was more or less, we had our rituals, you had the funeral, you had various steps, and outside of that, we pretty much turned the other way. Now there's much more of an enlightenment around grief and loss, much more of an intention around supporting those who are going through it. And then there's the mental and emotional health of the individual who's experiencing the grief. And at CARA, when someone has, let's say, complicating factors, there may be addictions involved or some kind of abuse in the family, when those complications are part of the bereavement, CARA will assign that client to a therapist at CARA rather than a peer counselor. And a therapist is able to work with all of these issues that may be compounding the grief experience. So I'm going to pause there. Are there any other questions or comments at this point?
Thank you. I just lost the second one of my siblings. I'm the eldest. My younger brother and sister both passed away, and I'm angry, very angry, that they didn't take better care of themselves.
Yes.
I didn't expect that emotion.
Yes, and many of us don't. Anger is definitely one of the emotions that is frequently experienced. If not at the person who's died, at the doctors who cared for the person, or the way a family caregiver supported that person. There's all kinds of reasons that might generate the emotion of anger for us. And again, that is something that is completely legitimate to talk about in a counseling session at CARA without being judged, and to actually be able to talk through what it is about that anger that has it come up. Any other comments or questions? Yes?
Yeah. Do you use the group process
Yes.
in counseling groups
Yes.
of people?
I'll describe in more detail what our services are, but yes, there are two levels. There's the one-on-one, a counseling or therapy, and then there's group. Okay, so moving on a little bit. This is on the second page. I mentioned earlier that grief impacts us on all levels. Mentally, there can be confusion, intrusive images and memories, the capacity for decision-making and thinking processes may be diminished. This was particularly up for me after my wife died. I was running a web development business. So I would deal with the clients, come up with designs for their websites, and then manage the project that built and implemented and trained for that project. A lot of sequential steps, kind of complex processes. And I found that my mind could not handle it the way it used to. It was very slow. Some things I could hardly do at all. So the fact that in my first year of bereavement, the dot-com bubble burst and my website business went down to about 30% of what it was the previous year was actually a blessing. Because I don't know how I could have survived trying to support at the level that I had been supporting before. So one may experience confusion, forgetfulness, and all of these are very natural and very normal. And why it's important to know about what some of these impacts can be is, if I'm grieving, not only do I have the sadness over my loss, but I can also be scaring myself with how I'm behaving. I could scare myself with the fact that, oh, I can't do this work anymore. I'm never going to be able to do this work anymore. How am I going to support myself? And then it just kind of snowballs. So being able to sit with someone like a counselor at Cara, who basically knows the territory, maybe not in all the details you're dealing with, but is familiar with that, can be very calming and helpful, because the clients will not necessarily be afraid of their own experience. They're sitting with someone who can say, this is normal. Yeah, it's understandable that you'd be behaving this way. Emotionally, volatility. Shock and numbness initially. I definitely was in shock to some extent, and numb. And we tend to hold this as being a negative thing. It's actually a blessing. Whether it's a physical injury or an emotional injury, this numbness that we experience when we're shocked is a blessing. It diminishes the onslaught. It allows us to gradually take in the reality of what has happened. So shock and numbness can be often an early experience in loss. Anxiety, irritability. Now, for those of you who have experienced a personal loss, can you recognize any of these symptoms? Raise your hand if you can. Okay. Irritability, anyone particularly have experience with that? And for those loved ones that are caring about the person going through grief, this can sometimes be a challenge if they don't know that this is a natural part of how one responds to grief. They can think that this person has changed completely and expect them to stay that way indefinitely. And that's just not the case. Another thing emotionally that very frequently comes up is regret. When we know and love someone for a long period of time, there are going to be situations that maybe we're not very happy how we dealt with them. One of the things that came up for me after Claudia died was I regretted not giving her more attention and telling her more frequently how much I loved her, how I felt about her. And the other thing I noticed was that I regretted not appreciating her more, and it was only in her loss that I could appreciate the depth of who she was, what she meant to me. So it's in the absence that I connected at a deeper level. And the way I was able to resolve that was to realize, well, I can't do anything to change how I was with Claudia in the past. But I can do something to change how I am with you now. How do I love now from here on out? So part of my healing is to be aware of how my relationships have improved as a result of my experience of loss. And I thank Claudia for this, and I think every now and then I have the thought, well, she'd be really happy how I am in relationship now. So regrets are very often part of our loss. I'm going to just pause there. Any comments or questions so far? Yeah.
Dana St. George. About 5 years ago, I lost a younger sister very suddenly, and it was really a shock. And I felt some of those emotions like anger, but I was also very anxious, and for about 6 months or longer afterwards, I'd be driving or whatever, going to work, and I'd think, you know, Dana, at any moment you could drop dead, just like she did. And that really bothered me. But what seemed to bother me the most was the loss of what I thought of as my imaginary future. because I had gone up and visited her like at least a couple times a year in Oregon. They lived out in the country in a little town, Beaver Creek, and it was just, we had such great times together, and she was the sister that I was closest to. And I was just so appalled that this big chunk of my imaginary, it sounds very selfish, but there it was. I was really, really angry about that.
Yes. That is certainly a basic part of grief. In fact, if you look at number 7 on that slide, we grieve the person and the unfulfilled expectations and dreams. And that can be a very difficult combination to deal with. For myself, it was losing the dream of retiring together, traveling, raising grandchildren. All of that was gone in an instant. Any other comment or question? Yes.
That last point that you made about after your wife's death, one, there was the personal loss, and then the resolve to make a change in your behavior because you've appreciated the real importance, the depth of that relationship and what it meant. I was thinking about that some as I was looking at Kara's descriptions on the website before today. And it seems those are two very different things. And it brought to my mind the horror of December 13, when 20 children were murdered, were slaughtered, 6 staff members, 1 mother who was murdered in her bed by her son, and that disturbed, unhappy young man who did it all. Those are all to be grieved and to feel sorrow. I can't count the times I've had tears in my eyes since that day as I've thought about what happened there. And the other part of that is, and it seems to be entirely separate, is what can we do about it as you thought about. You know, I don't know how your wife died, but Mothers Against Drunk Driving, because of the death of a family member, a woman, started a movement which has probably saved many lives since then, with the emphasis to ending drunk driving. And I'd like you to talk, if you can, at some point in your presentation, about this transition from grieving to its role in our life after that point.
Okay, I will. And if I'm overlooking it as I wrap up, please remind me of that, because that's a very important point. Thank you. Yes.
I have a friend who's losing her father, and she just ended up going to Stanford Hospital with heart palpitations and anxiety, and she feels like she's kind of doing anticipatory grieving. And I wondered if you have any suggestions about that, or if that's something you see, people who can see the end coming and they don't know how to handle it.
This gets into the area of end-of-life conversations, and there are typically several themes that will come up. One is, I love you. Another is, I forgive you. Another is, do you forgive me? And goodbye. And all of the details typically fall under one or another of those categories.
Isn't there a book?
Yes, yes. I believe it's Doka. D-O-K-A is the author. Yeah, I don't remember the actual name of the book. But this is resulting from some research that was done. And they categorized all of these end-of-life conversations, and they tended to come under one or more of those categories. So one thing in terms of suggestion, it would be that you cover all those bases with this person. And not all may apply. You may feel there's nothing, for instance, to forgive. But it's good to think about each of these areas and to share what comes up for you. And that can be difficult because we're not really well schooled in how to communicate at that deep, fundamental, and emotional level. And we have some fears around it, like, well, what if this person misunderstands? I could make something worse for this person. So we tend to hold back. And the studies have shown that what is most helpful is just an honest communication around these areas.
I lost my son a couple of years ago. Of course, he was a mature man, and I feel a lot of grief as his mother for two reasons. One of them is that he was so promising. He was so healthy and so bright and so beautiful, and he became a drunkard. And I feel like I should have been able to do something. And the other reason I feel a lot of guilt is because the last time we were together, I feel as though he needed something and I really let him down, and I felt terrible, and then I never had a chance to do anything, you know, to supplant that memory with a more positive one.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that. I think there's a couple of things to be done here. One is to acknowledge the fact that there is only so much that any of us can do. And we tend to, especially in a caregiving, helping situation, cross the boundary into going into business and activity and concerns that we really can't control or influence very well. And we suffer over that. You know, so the first thing is to remind ourselves of our own limitations, of what we can do in any situation. Actually, I think that's the main point I wanted to make about that. But the other thing is, with a loss like this, there can be a lot of second guessing of oneself. If only I had done this instead of this. This comes up a lot with suicide loss, as you can imagine. One client that I had was the father of a 23-year-old who completed suicide using a gun. And the gun was something that the father knew the son had, and there were no indications of any problems like suicidality. And after the father heard about the suicide, suffered a lot of regret and pain over the fact that he should have taken that gun away from his son. And when you first hear it, one might react, well, of course. I mean, yeah, in retrospect, maybe that's what I should have done. But in reality, this was a grown man who looked mentally sound to everyone, who legally had a gun, and was a father going to go in there and actually take that from him? That's just not realistic, is it? And yet, we play this out and we have pain over it, and that is part of our healing, actually. It's not good or bad, it's just the natural part of our healing, whatever comes up. So there can be deep regrets around this, and part of the healing is not to change the past or to eliminate the regret, it's to hold the regret in balance with the reality of the situation. So yes?
I had a special question about how Kara deals with children and grief. My daughter died 6 or 8 years ago, and loved the contemporaries of her little 10-year-old daughter. She was someone who would run games for people at parties because she enjoyed interacting with children. She would scoop up a lot of kids and take them out for lunch. And Kara, the school was sensitive to this. This was Duveneck in Palo Alto, and brought in Kara to help children deal with grief, because for many of them this was the first friend that they had lost.
Yes.
And her hospice room was covered with drawings that children had given her. You know, that she was someone they really knew and needed. I guess I just wondered how you approach grief with little children.
Well, this is a part of Kara's service where we go out into the community, on site, to the community or the organization that has experienced the loss, in this case a school. And a lot of our clients are schools where there'll be a loss of a teacher or a parent of a child or a child, and a team of CAR volunteers will go there and have what we call it's a grief intervention, in that it takes usually about an hour, and it's facilitated by a CAR volunteer. And those who are there get to share, first of all, what the information is about the loss. Okay, because there can sometimes be very different rumors about what happened. So part of this process is to get all on the same page with, here's what happened. Then we move into more of how did you react or respond when you heard about this. And then the participants get to just share things around what their experience was. And finally, the third part is we wrap this up with the theme of how will you take care of yourself? Given that you're going through this grief, what are the ways in which you can take good care of yourself? Now, that's the general model. For children, depending on age, younger children tend not to be as verbal. So there may be activities to do with art, expressive arts. So there may be drawings that they make, so that there are other ways, games that they play, so that there are other ways that can help the children get in touch with their grief. One thing I'll say about our children's program is it is so important for a child who's experienced, let's say, the loss of a parent, to know that there are other children that have gone through a similar experience. Because this is, first of all, grief can be very isolating at any age, but for children, especially in the early teen through the teen stages, it can be very isolating, because the highest priority is to be normal among one's peers. And here you are walking around with this kind of emotional impact, and you're trying to act normal, and your relationships with your peers change because they've heard about it and they may be uncomfortable interacting with you about it. So there's a major isolating factor that goes on there. So a lot of the healing and help that CAR can provide is simply to offer an opportunity for these children to be with other children who are also mourning a loss. And that can be just a real transformative experience for them. So I want to just go on a little bit more about some of these impacts of grief. There are physical impacts of grief. Sleep and appetite can be impacted, either increasing or decreasing. Shortness of breath, fatigue, tension, and a lot of these symptoms, if you don't realize that grief has physical symptoms, you can think, oh, maybe I'm ill with something, or I have some kind of disease and I need to get checked out. And it's a good idea to get checked out anyway. But my point is that these physical impacts can be a very natural part of grief. Socially, I've mentioned the isolation. Behavioral, hyperactivity, impatience, and also use of alcohol and drugs can be impacted, self-medication. Spiritual, this can also be a major area being impacted by grief. Questioning one's beliefs of a lifetime. Questioning God, if one believes in God. How could a kind God, how could a loving God allow this to happen? We've certainly all heard that, if not experienced it directly. Anger at God, and confronting our own mortality. Someone shared just a little bit earlier that after a loss, she shared, I think with her husband, well, you know, you could go at any moment. When I experienced my loss, that was one of the major things that was up for me. I knew this intellectually, that anyone could go at any time. I knew it in my thinking, but this experience brought it home emotionally and in every other way, that we're all here for a limited amount of time. We don't know when the end's going to be. We don't know how it's going to be. And yet we go around life as if we could predict what's normal. And then when it doesn't happen that way, we feel, we suffer over the fact that it's not what we expected. The reality is, it's always been this way. And when we experience our first major loss, this kind of all comes home. Okay, one thing that I want to mention, I didn't have handouts for this, but there's a wonderful article on our website called The Mourner's 6 Reconciliation Needs. So if you visit our website, and the URL is at the end of the handout, I encourage you to go and check that article out. It talks about various, basically 6 areas of need, and it's not a psychologist's kind of presentation. It's very much accessible to people without any kind of special training. Now I want to go a little bit into how to help the grieving. Starting out with this quote from Henry Nouwen in his book Out of Solitude. And this, I would say, is a guiding light of what Cara offers to its clients. The one who can be present with us in our hours of grief, who can tolerate not knowing, and face with us the reality of our vulnerability. That is the one who gives us our best caring. Now notice there's no skills in here, there is no fixing, there's no special certification. This is very basic humanity right here that we're talking about. So a few things to do when helping the bereaved. Certainly let your concern show. Be available as you can to listen and help, especially listen. Allow them to express all their feelings and thoughts. Someone mentioned anger and how it was a surprise when it came up. Well, sit with that as well. Allow that person to share whatever is up for them. And as I'm describing this, these are basically the ingredients that all of our volunteers are trained in. Encourage them to be patient with themselves, not to impose shoulds or shouldn'ts. And that's very important because it relates to the diminished capacity that I referred to earlier that sometimes grief can bring. So they may need more patience with themselves than usual. And the shoulds and shouldn'ts are just heaping upon additional burden when someone is going through grief. Oh, you should be crying more, or you shouldn't be crying so much, or all of these should and shouldn'ts that we have in our minds that we can sometimes say to the bereaved. Talk about the special and endearing qualities of the person they lost. This really is a heartfelt one for me, because one of the things that I found most healing in the first months after my loss was being with those who knew and loved my wife. And part of that was just not even verbal, just being with them, knowing how they felt about her was part of what helped me in my grief. And I particularly enjoyed when they would share things, especially things that I had never heard before, wasn't aware of. And they would share something about their experience with Claudia. That was just a wonderful experience for me. Now, for those of us who might consider sharing these things, again, we might have concerns and anxieties about, well, maybe I shouldn't do that, because if I talk about their loved one, I could make it worse. You know, I could make them cry, or I could upset them. So we tend not to say anything. That's often the reaction that we have. And I'm encouraging you to go ahead and, if the time is appropriate and so forth, to go ahead and share these things and experience with that person how they do with it, and you may be surprised at how helpful it is to them. Now, some things to avoid. Letting your own sense of helplessness keep you from reaching out. And this is certainly something I think we can all relate to, especially not having gone through an experience of loss personally. This can be a very daunting challenge. What could I do? What would I say? So we feel completely unprepared, and we don't make the connection with that person. Avoiding them because I'm uncomfortable. All right. This is something that I think just about everyone that I've ever sat with sharing about their grief has said at some time or other, and that is that so many of their friends and family are no longer communicating with them, no longer in their lives. Now, one could immediately go to judgment. How could they possibly abandon this person at a time when they need the support the most? But that's not, in my experience, really the dynamic. It's more this fear of making things worse, and this fear that I have nothing to say or do that could really help. All right, so the encouragement here is don't let that stop you. Saying how you know how they feel. This is another trigger for bereaved, especially if you haven't had a loss like this. Maybe you've had no loss, and you say something like that, and because grief is so unique, the person hearing this is likely to not appreciate that comment or even to get angry, and you may know about it or you may not know about their reaction. Even those of us at CARA, for instance, who are counselors who have experienced deep personal loss and who know a lot about what the experience is, wouldn't be saying something like this. I never say that to a client. I can relate to certain aspects of their grief. I can share some things from my own experience that can help, but to assume that I know what their experience is first of all not true, and certainly not helpful to them. Oh, here's a good one. You ought to be feeling better by now. Our expectations around grief are really completely unrealistic. Grief can take more than a year. Grief can take years. It certainly doesn't take days or weeks, as in the work setting. There's continued impacts of grief ongoing. So to say you should feel better by now really is making the process of the person who's grieving wrong. Okay, so you could see where that might add a burden to that person hearing that. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't any situation where one might be concerned about the length of time and the intensity of grief. So at CARA, if something like that is happening, the counselor will consult with CARA staff. Okay, and we will help determine, well, perhaps there's a need here for additional support beyond the peer counseling that's been offered so far. But in general, grief takes much longer than we would expect. Has anyone had that experience? Yeah. I'll just tell one personal story. I mentioned the ups and downs and the unpredictability. You would think after, 10 years or so that that would no longer be occurring. But I was at a wedding in Europe of a family where the groom had lost his father when he was a young teenager. And the mother was there, and when it came time to toasting, the mother, and this was, it would have been 20 plus years after the loss. When it came time to toasting, the mother was toasting and just said, I wish his dad could be there, and immediately started crying. And I remember this was long before I was involved with my own loss, before I was involved with CARA, so I was just like, the standard public, kind of clueless. And I looked around the room and I could see that people were shocked and even a little bit horrified that this would happen in the midst of a wedding. Well, this is actually something that could easily happen because this is a very special experience. This is part of what someone shared. I didn't lose just the person. I lost all of these dreams and hopes about what we would be sharing in the future. And here, one of her hopes for she and her husband to experience the marriage of their son was not even possible. And that put her in touch with her grief again, almost as if it were day one. Now, does this mean that there was no healing? Does this mean that there was no progress over time? Absolutely not. This is just the fundamental dynamic of grief. We can connect with our grief really at any time. Comments? Questions?
Yes, I'm Amy, and I lost my husband 7.5 years ago, and I can testify to what you just said because I was held by CARA. I stayed with CARA for about 1.5 years, and it really helped me tremendously. just being around people who were experiencing the same thing that I was experiencing helped me a lot. My husband was in a wheelchair for about 4 years, and even now, 7.5 years later, every time I see a guy of a certain age in a wheelchair, I almost break down, even though I'm dealing with life very well, but still, and I'm in a good relationship right now, I still break down once in a while.
And I think that's a beautiful thing. I still occasionally break down. And instead of holding breaking down as losing control or being out of control or having it be such a negative thing, I've learned to hold these emotional experiences and waves as part of the confirmation of being a human being someone who cared and loved that much that I could feel this way, and just letting whatever the emotion experience of the moment happen without getting in its way. So, and it's reassuring to me that even now I can have these experiences. And you know, at one point I had some fear, and this is a very common fear among the bereaved, that I'll forget. I'll forget who she was. I'll forget who she was to me. I just find that that is completely unfounded, that fear. We are in relationship with this person for our entire life, whether they're here physically or not. Anything else? Comment or question?
Yes. Have any statistics ever been done about the grief or the degree of grief of people who have lost, due to natural death, their spouse, their significant other, or a very close relative, whether in case they, one that is the one that would be suffering or crying or whatever in grief, believes in a better world, in a hereafter with a better world, or in reincarnation, or what have you not. If there is a difference compared to those that say, no, they might be going to hell, or when they're dead, they're dead.
Well, certainly one's religious beliefs are a factor in grief. I don't know that one can say that certain behaviors show up in one and not the other. For instance, if one believes in God, that invites the possibility of being angry at God for what happened. If one doesn't believe in God or any of that kind of scenario, there's nobody to be angry at. Well, there's no God to be angry at. You can still be angry at the doctor or whoever else. So there are things like that, but I don't know that it really impacts, you know, in a profound way. In some cases, it may. I do know that many faith communities will experience that the faith itself helps ease the pain of the loss. So if one is believing that my loved one went to heaven and is in a good place, you know, I might hold that emotionally differently than otherwise. Yep.
Are you still taking? I'm sorry. Are you still taking questions?
Yeah, I'll take another question.
We have about 5 stacked up. 5 hands went up at once. So I'm going to go through, and as I walk by, put your hand up again, okay? Because I can't tell the difference.
Yes, I wanted to comment. You said something about it's comforting to talk about the loved one, that to have your friends say, "I remember this." In my case, nobody around me knew him or had ever met him. But it would have been helpful if they'd said, saw his pictures, if they'd said he was a beautiful boy, or he must have been a wonderful person, something. Nobody talked about him. They talked about, oh, I'm so sorry for your loss. But I missed that nobody commented on him, and so he was just a picture, a ring on my finger. You know?
Yes. That's a very important aspect, is to have one's deceased loved one acknowledged by the world. And it reminds me that one of the things that I will do with a new client in the first few sessions that we meet is ask the client to bring in a photo album or photos, and we'll talk about that. Our counselors really get to know the loved one who has died through the client. And that's part, again, of the healing process. We as counselors did not know that person, but we can get to know them through your sharing. And that's an important part of helping someone. Yes?
I wonder how many people have this kind of reaction, because they found out where I was working that my mother had died. I don't know how that happened. I don't think I mentioned it, but anyway. So they wanted me to take 3 days off. And I didn't want to leave. I wanted to stay at work. And then at that week, she died in 1988, so I was in pretty good shape out there. But I would go out at lunchtime and run some of the longest runs I ever did. And it was almost to the extent that I could barely stay awake. I was so tired.
Mm-hmm. Well, first to your comment about wanting to go to work. Again, everyone's grief is unique and different. Many clients have shared with me that they are thankful for their work, that they had somewhere to go, that they had people to be with, that where it wasn't too intimate, it wasn't too challenging socially, and they could focus their mind on tasks that took the mind off of the immediate loss. These are all very positive aspects. And in fact, talking about the mind being able to focus on something beside the grief, we call that dosing, that one doses with one's grief. There's a time to connect with it, like during a car visit, and there's a time to have some respite from it, whether it's to be with a friend or do something that one enjoys, or whatever that is, go to work, be with grandchildren, whatever those activities are, so that there's a balance between living the life that's here now and acknowledging and mourning the life that was.
Yes, our granddaughter just went through something. She's a high school, she's 14, and one of her friends died suddenly, I think committed suicide, and it really affected her. But what she did was so positive. She wrote all the facts that she knew about this young girl, and she set up a disc, and she wrote in the school paper of all the positive things she remembers about her. And then she sent the disc to her family, and talked about the girl. And that was the most positive approach I've ever seen for a young teenager to do. And we were overjoyed that she did that. And she had a rough life as a young girl herself, and so this was important to her. In fact, it was so important that the school newspaper hired her to be their reporter. So that's what she's doing now. But it was so positive an approach, I thought.
Thank you for sharing that. And before we have our next question, I'd like to reinforce a theme that came up earlier, and that is, at some point, one is moving on with one's new life, the new normal. And this is one example of where part of this girl moving on was to commemorate the loss in this particular way. We have clients that have started up nonprofit charities for various aspects. Someone mentioned MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. That's another example of some positive outcome of a tragic loss. For me, I came to realize that in the first couple of years, my web development business was no longer really inspiring me. I didn't have the passion I used to have about it. I was asked to become a car volunteer, and I volunteered, and later on asked to join staff, and I just naturally said yes. And I realized that these choices that I was making was a part of my healing, and in particular in the area of building my new life. And it wasn't a plan I had, even though I have very technical background where planning and strategic planning and laying out the projects and all that was definitely a strength I had, but this process was nothing like that. It was more of just being becalmed, first of all, and then slowly being called in a certain direction and having the internal space and silence to actually hear the call. So the work that I do with Cara is partly a acknowledgement of Claudia and who she was, and that my experience of grief can have this positive effect by doing this kind of work. So there are all kinds of ways that we find to move on, including new relationships. Now before, yes, one more question?
Is there a cost to members, and is there any time limit?
I'll be wrapping up with a Cara overview, and I'll include that. So I just want to go on a little bit more, and we'll wrap up with some questions at the end. So Cara's a little overview about Cara. We're a nonprofit charity that has been in existence since 1976. So we were one of the first 1 or 2 such organizations in the United States. I mentioned we provide peer support as well as grief-related therapy. We have programs focused on youth and family, and those programs, the children go into an age-appropriate group, while the parent or parents meet in an adult group while the children are meeting. And those groups occur twice a month. We have Camp Erin, and I have a brochure up here on the front table here. Camp Erin is a 2-day summer camp experience at a beautiful facility where children, we have about 90 children coming this year in July. And what's important about that camp, as I said before, children need to be with other children who are in similar situations. So Camp Erin, even if they're not coming to other Cara services, they could be from the East Bay, or they could, if actually we've had children fly in from other parts of the country, they get to experience being with other children in grief. And there's dosing there. There are certain pieces where they will do a grief exercise, drawing or something like that. And then there's just the general camp play, zip lines and climbing walls and pools and soccer and all kinds of activities go on. So this mixture that occurs allows these children to both express and connect with their grief, hear the experience of others, as well as have just a really wonderful 2 days of summer camp. So if you know of a grieving family where a child might benefit from something like this, keep us in mind for next year. Also, if you feel particularly called to this, you can sponsor a child by giving a donation to Cara, and that can be allocated to a child attending Camp Erin. Some other services I mentioned, the outreach, where we will go to a school or an organization and do a grief intervention to allow them to process some of that grief. And also the end that I manage is the training and education area, where we will train professional caregivers, doctors, doctors, nurses, chaplains, hospice people, therapists, particularly in the area of grief, because it probably wouldn't surprise you to know that most of these professionals get about this much training in grief. In terms of the emotional part of it. So, and yet they come up with it, you know, they're facing this on a very frequent basis in their work. We also have a professional caregivers group where these nurses and doctors and therapists can meet twice a month. So I think I've covered the general overview of our services. Now about fees, all of our peer services are for no fee, for donation only. That means that literally anyone who is appropriate for peer support can receive either group or counseling support for no fee, just for a donation, and whatever they can afford. So there is a need at Cara to raise funds to support these kinds of clients. And this comes in, a lion's share comes from grant writing, but most of it comes from the local community. And the Palo Alto area, the Peninsula area, has been for many years very supportive of Cara and allowed us continue this work. Now, there are some for-fee services. The grief-related therapy is for a fee, and that is on a sliding scale. When I go out to train professionals, there's a fee for that. But those are the only for-fee services that we currently offer. So now we have just a few minutes in general for any questions or comments. Mike? Someone back there, yes.
Our son died in 1982. That's Jackie, my loving Jackie. I still cannot even feel my whole wound heal. I have two other sons. It's not because his death makes me think he is the most loving son. He surely is. And later I had depression, and I have violence to the depression drugs. But now I'm still on depression. I'm okay, but I'm taking ballet, growing roses, and then a few years ago, my brother died of ALS, the Lou Gehrig disease, and my best friend died, and my dog died. Everything is just like coming back, the illness. Good thing I still have my husband. I want to die first before him. But anyway, Jackie gave us so much love and teach us so much things. Even the short life, he died or committed suicide. He was born with heart defect, but because of the girl relationship, he just cannot stand it. It is just so strange that day. He was working, and he is also going to college while he was in high school taking classes. And that time, the company gave everyone $100 cash. And he used the cash to go to Best, buy the shotgun. He was so cheerful. I cannot even know he had depression.
Yes.
It is very strange.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that. Especially with that kind of death, a suicide death, there are so many unanswered questions. And the healing that occurs with that kind of grief is not that we get the answers to that question, but that we come to peace with the question itself, and that we can just sit with that even though we don't know the answers. And that can be a difficult process to go through. Thank you for sharing. One more? Yeah.
I got counseling from somebody at my workplace after my mother died in '94, but I wish I'd known about Kara because I had a kind of a peripheral grief issue. I was thinking so much about how, obviously I was very upset that my mother died, but one of my sisters who came from back east, who got there just a few hours actually before my mom died, was taking such care of my father that I felt not left out, but ignored when I was trying to be helpful. And so I was getting counseling for that issue more than the actual grief of my mother dying. I offered to help in some way, and I was ignored. I wanted somebody to say, well, thank you for suggesting that or offering that, but I think we'll do this instead. Instead, she was so busy taking care of my dad that she just totally ignored me, and I was more upset about that. Yes. But I think maybe if I'd had, I had good counseling, but I think I would have done better if I'd come to Kara.
Well, one of the things that this comment points out is what is the grief experience and what is other than the grief experience. One could look at that and say, well, this wasn't a grieving issue, but the reality is, yes, this is absolutely a grieving issue because it has to do with my need to take care of, to participate, to support that end-of-life process. And it can feel very isolating and being cut out for that in this kind of situation. So all of that is part of grief, and many of our clients share about these kinds of things that have to do with family relationships and situations that occurred up to the death and after. So with that, we're going to close the presentation, and yes?
I just want to let you know that we have about 5 extra minutes, so you can keep going if you want. Yes.
Okay, we can go with another question or two.
Just quickly, I wanted to ask you if this is online, because I noticed a number of people didn't get a copy, and I'm keeping this one to give to a friend who really needs to see this.
Okay.
So if you would tell us if we can find it online, it would be great.
It will be posted online, and I just need to send somebody an email with the link, and that person can share it with the entire humanist community. So whoever that person would be that I should send an email to, get to me before I go. Okay, thank you.
Excuse my ignorance, but what does CARA stand for?
CARA is not an acronym. It's not K dot, A dot, and so forth. CARA is a word. It's the Gothic root of the word that means to care, to grieve with, to lament. Yeah. Now, before I say goodbye, I'd like to remind you that there's a pamphlet on Camp Aaron, as well as a general pamphlet describing CARA's services. And also you'll find, if you're able to make a donation today, there are donation envelopes that you can fill out and leave in the donation box in the front. And CARA certainly appreciates any support that you can provide to help us carry these services on. Thank you.